Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Battle Chads. I'm your host, Sam, and I'm joined by my co host, Josh. Hi, Josh.
Hello, Sam, and hello, everybody.
So, you may have noticed that even though we're two-thirds of Battle Chads, we're joined by another Chad Magic member here, Christian. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
And you may be wondering why exactly we got Christian on. He's not demanded it this time. This time, Christian's here because he took down an RCQ. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that, Christian?
Yeah, so this weekend won the RCQ over in Fanboy 3 in Manchester. So shout out to them. Really, really good store. If you're in Manchester,
Great
please go
store.
check them out. And through a grueling standard season, managed to get there. And I'll be going to Bologna with the rest of the team.
It's funny that you mentioned that grueling standard season because you chose quite a grueling deck to play in that event. You chose, I guess, a new up and comer in the standard meta, Blue Eye Control.
Well, those who know me will know that I am a man of culture, and as a man of culture, I tend to go towards the control decks, and blue-white control being my absolute favorite archetype within Magic. And I was impressed with some of the decks from the Pro Tour, and in particular, there's a card called Stock Up, which we'll talk about, that I think makes the deck viable. And I also anticipated, what the meta was going to look like, and I actually thought it's quite well positioned. And given the fact that I feel like it's an archetype I'm really confident and comfortable with playing, I can pick up a blue-white control deck fairly quickly and understand the play patterns. I thought it was worth giving it a go, and this time it paid off. I think it's my fourth or fifth different standard deck of the season, but we got there in the end.
I think I felt quite bad actually because we had a conversation before the Pro Tour on how I was like, just give up control. Like control's just not like control everywhere is just dead. Like don't even bother. And then after the Pro Tour, you had Arnie Huschenbeck who did really well with the blue white control standard deck, and then we had some modern control decks popping up with with the miracle sort of package, etc. So it was actually like I've sort of ate my own hat by by trying to keep you away from control, and then you come and pull out this really impressive win.
Yeah, we're going to get to the list in a second, and this is based around Eli Cases's list from that competition. So that shout out to him for and I think Team Handshake as well have been developing the list. So yeah, I want to give them credit where credit's due for the main conception. But funnily enough, Josh, I had a similar conversation with Covert Go Blue CGB, who's a content creator I really respect. He obviously plays mostly best of one. A lot of people who are control players will watch him on YouTube. And we were having conversation in Chicago about where we thought control was, and he was like, it's very difficult at the moment as well. And it was funny because we had a conversation very briefly on Twitter. I said, is control back on the menu? And he seems to like that idea after the RC win. But yeah, I think that the people on the Pro Tour are probably a bit smarter than I am. I say probably, obviously they are, but
doesn't take much.
Yeah, I don't think that they probably had greater praise poured on them than that. I think there's a real gap in the meta for this, and I know we're going to get onto that at the moment. But I think with domain being so prevalent and also the aggro decks being so prevalent, having a control deck that can fight both of those decks leaves it really well positioned. So I think control is back on the menu. We'll see how that develops, because obviously if it becomes a very control meta and we see a rise in Dimir mid range, it can become a bit more challenging. But given like the Gruul decks, the domain decks, and to an extent the Pixie decks, and being so prevalent, I think it's well positioned at the moment, and that was my sort of decision making going into the RCQ.
So before we move on to the actual deck itself and the game plan, etc., Christian, can you just give us a quick introduction of yourself? Like, because obviously the listeners might not know who you are, because everyone listens to Battle Chads, as you said, are cultured listeners and tend to stay away from sort of casual, dirty commander play. So can you just tell us, because obviously you are the captain of Team Chad Magic in terms of the founder of it, etc. But tell us a bit about yourself, a bit about Chad Magic, etc. Just for the listeners.
Let me clarify that one, because I abstain from being the captain because I'm sort of the maybe the director or like of Team Chad Magic, so I make the off the field decisions. Well, alongside Wally, who's my a content creator partner for the main channel, which is mainly based around Commander gameplay. But deep down, off the Commander gameplay channel, I am very much a competitive player. I love 1v1 Magic, especially Standard. I'm a big advocate of Standard. For those who, I've already spoken about my love for control decks, but my biggest passion is sort of community building within the Magic space, especially locally and within the Chad Magic umbrella. So probably my biggest achievement in Magic, rather than like sort of performance in a competition, is we now get 21 people every week to Standard in our local store, Just Play. And shout out to Richie and the team there. They run a great store. I know Sam actually used to work there as well.
Yeah, a long time ago now, yeah.
And it's great to see that. And so community building and 1v1 formats are really at the heart of what I want to do. But of course, I love playing Commander as well. And that's maybe what I'm known for within the community. So if you like playing all different formats, I recommend go and check out Chad Magic, our YouTube channel, where you'll see me basically beat a load of casual people at Commander.
Just to add to that, Chris, and that's soon to be 22, because I really need to get my act into gear with Standard, so I'm going to have to start showing up to those events.
You've been playing on MTGO, haven't you? But I assure you it is more fun in paper.
Yeah, I've been trying to play an MTGO, locked in the basement, lights off, very little water intake throughout the day. That's the best the way to play MTGO.
Josh not letting you out, is he not? He's got you trapped in there.
No, he's nice to me most of the time, but that's the way it is. I think I'm happy with that. I'm not complaining. Sorry, Josh.
As long as you put the lotion in the basket, you're all right.
I'll make a note of that, lotion in basket. So let's say, Christian, I come down to the next Standard event at Just Playing. We're paired against each other. From a blue-white control point of view, why would you choose to play blue-white control at this current time? Because you said it's good against Domain, which honestly, off the top, is quite surprising to hear, and I'll explain why in a minute. But how does blue-white control win games? Why should I choose to play this or potentially take a look into this if I'm wanting to explore Standard?
Sure. So blue-white control as an archetype wants to win the long game. Essentially, it wants to grind out your opponent, reduce their resources until you're in a position where they can't win the game, and then close it out. That's like the usual way of doing it. There are times when you will be proactive. For example, there are some ways to be proactive against like the Domain matchup, which we'll come into when we go through the cards. But in general, this is for people who like to react to what their opponent is doing and basically answer a game plan, as opposed to maybe be the person who's asking the questions. So for me, it's natural for me to want to be that sort of control player, as I prefer to be the person who's actually thinking about what's presenting in front of me, how best to answer it, and how best to play that long game and then win with win conditions that are maybe a little bit slower but can grind out against your opponent.
And can you just touch upon those win conditions for me now? Because I am quite tempted by what you're selling here.
So this deck has a few different win conditions. I'll talk about the mill win condition first. So this deck plays for Jace, the Perfected Mind. This is a win condition into other control games, for example, the Mirror, or against Domain control. So Domain cycles through cards really quickly. They play up the beanstalk, they play big spells, they draw a lot of cards, and it takes a lot of cards for them to win against you. Essentially, Jace, the Perfected Mind, which is 2 a blue and a Phyrexian blue mana, allows you to essentially, when it comes down, you can -5 and mill them for 15 straight away. It may be that you don't want to do that. You maybe want to leave them on 1. But the idea here is that this is actually a bit like a burn strategy, but for mill. In the sense that, well, actually, if you do this a couple of times and then just live, eventually your opponent will run out of resources. The same is kind of true in the Mirror, in that, whoever lands the more Jaces will tend to win that game. It does have an aggressive strategy as well. The aggressive strategy is with things like the Overlord of the Mistmoors to make your little flyers, which can attack your opponents. And then you've got things like a Hornlock Whale and Beza, which can get in, as essentially creatures through combat damage. And then you've also got your lands as well. You've also got some creature lands in Restless Anchorage that can also attack your opponents as well. So they're the win conditions within the deck. As a control deck, you don't tend to run many. I know this is probably like an entry-level sort of conversation here, and we'll get into the more specific stuff for the the more competitive players later. But we don't need a lot of win conditions. Our main use of our cards is to essentially make our opponents run out of their ways to win until that we can enact our basically our final game plan.
You're probably winning more on concessions than you are on actually on beating them, because if you listen to our last podcast about when to concede a game of Magic, Christian's essentially saying, I'm going to present you one of the conditions in which you should concede a game of Magic because you have no meaningful game actions left. Would you agree with that?
I think that it's more of a challenge for new players. I think when they come up against a control deck, to understand when you have lost the game. But yeah, essentially, if you're in a tournament and you win, you're in game one, you're 30 minutes into the game, your opponent's like, how am I going to win this game? They should definitely concede to try and then beat me in 2 games, because otherwise I'm just going to control you out to time in game 2. But yeah, we do see that. It was a really subtle plug there for your last episode, but I would genuinely recommend it, because I think knowing when to concede is really important, especially in a control matchup. And that goes for when you're playing control as well. You might need to know when to concede game 1, because winning 2 games is going to be quite a time-consuming task, and you want to get started on that straight away if your percentage chances is reaching 0.
Well, from someone who does actually like to win the game every now and then, I know I don't do it often, but I really do like to try. That sounds absolutely miserable to be on the opposite end of, and I really want to take a look at this deck list.
Should we start? Should we talk about? So you've already talked about Jace. So we'll read Jace out. So Jace is a 2 and a blue and a Phyrexian. He has the completed mechanic, so you can actually pay Phyrexian mana to essentially pay for it on turn 3, but it'll be at a reduced loyalty cost. So you +1 it comes in as 5 loyalty unless you play the completed cost. So +1 until your next turn, up to 1 target creature gets -3 -0. If you -2, target player mills 3 cards, and if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you may draw 3 cards. Otherwise, you draw a card. So there's some card advantage there, as I'm sure you're going to get onto in a minute. And -X is target player mills 3 times X cards. So Christian, you've already spoke about this card, but tell us a bit more about it.
So this is in the main deck, and it is probably the card that comes out the most into the sideboard, and we'll talk about the sideboard in later, and I know we'll attach a guide for the lovely listeners as well. But it's not dead against aggro because of the plus ability. Mm-hmm. Do not underestimate that -3, -0 in terms of reducing the power cost, the power rating, of your opponent's creatures. That is definitely useful. But the primary use of this card is to beat Domain and to win in the mirror. So the decks that I came up against, because I played the mirror 3 times when I was at the RCQ, which is a lot, and my brain has only just recovered from playing those mirror matches. But having 4 Jason main as opposed to 3 was incredibly useful in those matchups. I had more game against them than they had against me, because in control, if you're losing all the cards in your deck, you need them to win. You need the game to go long. And so the minus ability is used in the control matchups. The plus ability is used in the aggressive matchups. And then probably the middle ability you're using in the mid-range matchups a little bit. Well, it's obviously a bit dependent, but to try and get ahead on cards. If it's your second Jason, you've milled the opponent for 15, then the -2 ability gets much better, because they've probably, I don't know, binned a couple of cards here and there, and now you can draw 3. And if you're drawing 3 off your Planeswalker, your opponent's in a really bad spot. So this is kind of like one of the ways the deck has a proactive plan with this Planeswalker. But there are a lot of matchups that you bring this out for. But here's the thing. When you play the mirror or you play against Domain, you are naturally going to have longer games. And so having 4 in the main deck is really, really useful in those matchups. And you can, if you get a couple of them in your hand against like an aggressive deck, you would probably mulligan that hand.
Would you ever be in a position where you cast this for the Phyrexian cost at turn 3 or 3 mana?
Yes, you would. So if I would rather cast it for the 4 mana cost in the control matchups. But if your opponent is tapped out and maybe has 1 creature on board, then it's a really, really good opportunity to just drop this for 3 and then start plussing it, because it's something they have to deal with. And in those circumstances, it is good to do that. I actually won the final by casting it for its Phyrexian cost, but that was because my opponent only had 9 cards left in the library, so I didn't need it. And so there are times when that happens. Most of the time, I find myself casting it for 4, but in the aggressive and mid-range matchups, then it may be maybe 3.
And Jace is a bit of an odd one because there's you can use that plus early in an aggro matchup, but that might be the exchange for 2 life. But let's say we're in the control mirror or domain versus control, where we really want this card to shine. Can you touch upon the play patterns of Jace a little bit? Because do you get him resolved and then mill as much as you can immediately, or do you get him resolved and then plus once or twice, or do you just really want to harper on that -X?
It depends on what your opponent's options are. So, for example, Domain's main removal for this is a Leyline Binding, and that is very risky for them. So I quite like the -4 to mill them for 12. Obviously, they can potentially get lost it, but then they've used the get lost on something that could be, used for an enchantment. If they use a Leyline Binding on it, I think it's a real risky move from them because you could get lost it yourself and just mill them again. And then at that point, it becomes really good against the control deck. And obviously, that was my main game. I played 3 games of that. Resolving the Jace is the important thing to resolve. You've obviously got game with the Overlords, which we'll come to and things like that. But my goal going into those mirrors was I need to resolve my Jace. So whatever happens, I'm not gonna play the Jace into a counterspell to burn it. I'll play my other cards into a counterspell to burn them because I'm confident with the Wraths in the deck. I can deal with the rest of the things a control deck will do from an aggressive standpoint, but it's very hard for them to deal with having a quarter of their library just disappear. So the play pattern with Jace in those matchups is slightly different. It may be that you maybe just want to -5 to mill them for 15 against Domain, but I like the idea of being like, if they've only got a Leyline Binding and you get lost them, then it's double bubble, isn't it? And they're in real trouble then. I didn't mean to rhyme all those words, but yeah. Double bubble, they're in trouble. Here comes Jace.
So you've got some creatures in here as well. Should we just move on to the creatures? We'll talk
Sure.
talk about the creatures in a one array. So you've got Beza, the Bounding Springs. Beza's so good. Then you've got Hornlock Whale, and then you've got Overlord of the Mistmaws. They all come and do very different things. Can you just explain the roles of each one of these creatures within your game plan and what they're there for? Because they look to me quite toolboxy and serve a purpose in your overarching game plan.
Well, how I think about Beza for control players who've been playing control for a while is this is like now your Wandering Emperor. This is like that slot. In that this is the card that turns the tide from one area to the other. So Beza is a huge leveler in a game and can really swing it. So we always talk about Beza being so good. We have an aggro matchup. You just gain 4 life and you've got 2 blockers plus Beza on the board because it makes fish and life. You're in a control matchup or things like that. Hey, guess what? You've now drawn a card and made a treasure. And these type of things make it just a fantastic card, alongside the fact that it is a 4/5 by itself as well.
She thick.
Yeah.
She thick.
Beza is a really important card and is critical to the deck. I tend to use my Beza when I really need to just turn that dial. So there are some circumstances against an aggro deck where you will want to Wrath and sometimes you'll want to Beza. I like to Beza first because they use their resources to get rid of the Beza, and that's when you see. So I played against my teammate Dan, and obviously one of you guys from Battle Chads. I played like a Beza before the Wrath, even though I could have Wrathed, because I knew that he's going to have to devote some cards in his hand to getting rid of it. And if he starts using his burn spells on fish and things like that, I'm starting to deplete his resources, and then I'll just Wrath anyway. So my play pattern with Beza is I like to Beza before the Wrath. Other people might differ. Sometimes Beza will just be, this is your way to win the game. You just need another creature on the board. But for me, it's that card similar to the Wandering Emperor. I'd love it if it had Flash, but it'd be too good. But it just changes the tide a little bit on the game. And so yeah, Beza is a really, really key part of this deck. And I think you'll see it in all control decks. Some of them are running 4 copies. I'm running 3 because I like to have a few different cards in there as well. But the 4th one, for those of you who've looked, is in the sideboard for those matchups as well. But yeah, Beza is so good.
So Beza says, so it's a legendary creature, elk, elemental elk, for 2 generic and 2 white. When Beza, the Bounding Spring, enters, create a treasure token if an opponent controls more lands than you. You gain 4 life if an opponent has more life than you. Create 2 +1/+1 fish. Sorry, 1/1 fishes. Creature tokens if an opponent controls more creatures than you. Draw a card if an opponent has more cards in hand than you. So it's if each one is satisfied, each sort of condition is satisfied, then you could potentially get every one of these. So they're not sort of isolated to each other.
If you get a full house Beza, let me tell you, that feels good.
It's taking a look at Beza on the front side as well. All of these modes are slightly more frustrating to be sat against than we regularly see in cards like this too. We've seen stabilizing engines before that sort of put a full stop in the game of where we're up to at the moment. But it's the fact that it's 4 life instead of 3, and it creates 2 extra blockers as well as a 4/5 instead of just that 1 extra blocker. And I'm sure that, as Christian was saying, that it's about depleting resources, and that she's a great engine at doing that. What I'm interested in is she obviously gaining life and making blockers against aggro is fantastic and well advised in most games of Magic. But is there any other matchups that she shines in that you might not guess just by taking a look at her?
Yeah, I think it's the ones where the resources really matter too. So you've got some matchups where, like, things like which hate your hand out a little bit and make you like your pixies and things like that, where Beza can really help you there as well, just by providing a little bit more. I just think generally the card's pretty good. The matchups that I mean, and so you got like good mid range stuff as well. The matchups that I don't tend to like Beza into as much is sort of like the control matchups. But having played it this weekend, she's been really good in those matchups as well, because the card is so modal. Like, it really can just help you get there. So I'll put it in the sideboard guide where I think you should maybe put the Bezas in. Sorry, take Bezas out, but mainly it's more about putting the Beza in for the matchups where she really matters, which is like the aggressive matchups, because you play a Beza against your mono red or your Gruul opponent, and they have to board for it. They have to bring in the is it called Lithomatic Barrage?
Yes.
Is it? Oh, yeah.
Deal 5 damage to.
They have to bring in these, but that card, they're devoting a whole card to killing Beza. And I've probably gained 4 life and made 2 other creatures as well. So, yeah, you're right to ask me the question. There are some matchups where it feels better than others. But, I mean, I played a Convoke game, and it was insane against Convoke as well. But yeah, I'll put it in the full sideboard guide about what I bring Beza out for. But in general, like, this is like part of the heartbeat of the deck.
Talk to me about a big whale. Tell me about
I love
this.
the whale. Right, I love the whale. Now, I've had loads of arguments with control players about the whale. Everyone's told me it's not good enough. This was way before the Pro Tour. I was experimenting with the whale in blue-white control, and this was one of the cards that I was like, it's really good. A lot of people told me that this wasn't worth running, and this is the one which I was like, no, I'm having the one-off whale. It's so good against red decks. You basically, you put a creature on the top or the bottom of the library. That's really frustrating for them. They have a decision to make about that. It also means I have if they put it on top, I've got the information. I know that Screaming Nemesis is coming back next turn, and things like that. And they've got to devote now a whole nother turn to playing the creature again. Or they put it on the bottom, and I'm like, well, that's essentially removal. And then I've got a 6/6 later in the game. This won me games. And I'll talk about some of the sideboard pieces of stuff to basically make it super powerful. But it's essentially a removal spell and a big creature that is at flash speed as well. So you can flash it in. So I quite like this as well. I kept it in versus control because it meant that I could flash it in, and again, it wouldn't be a control game. So over the course of the RCQ, this won me a game against red deck wins, and it won me a game against the mirror. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a good card. One of the things I would mention about it as well is it's 2 cards for 1 card,
Yes.
and that we are in the big challenge with blue-white control has been the fact that without the likes of like memory deluge, how do you keep the card advantage? That's the thing that it's been missing. I know we've been talking on our team chats, and this is me tearing my hair out and going grey over how do we get the card advantage. We'll talk about the key card in a second, but this is another way of doing it. My opponents, I didn't play this, and I think they suffered for it in the competition. Or sorry, I should say the people, or the other people running blue white. I would really recommend giving this a try if you don't already run this in your list. It's really good.
So, and Overlord of the Mistmores as well. That's another the other creature you choose to play as a 2 of. I'm not going to read the Overlord out because everyone should know what Overlord does because everyone's facing the domain mirrors.
2/1/1s.
And is that literally it? It's make just make 2/1/1s and it's a threat.
Yeah, so it's really good in your grindy matchups. Because essentially, you're getting a lot of value from it. You get two creatures that can block, they fly, they can be aggressive, so it's good aggressive, it's good on defense as well. It's also good against blue-black or blue-black X decks because you have flyers to match their flyers. Maybe you can kill Kaito with them if you're really lucky.
Yeah.
But I've been really impressed with this one. I like it against Domain as well because it kind of counters theirs. So you kind of need this card against decks that also run it and decks that run flyers. But it's really good in those grindy matchups as well. So I really like this. It also is an important card for giving you a proactive, aggressive game plan as well. And that can be important because there are some times where you need to go a bit more aggressive, and this is the card that will help you do it. But essentially, the opponent's got to answer 2 creatures, and then they've got to answer the impending 6/6 that's going to attack them and make more creatures. So this is like a big win con of the deck as well.
Yeah, and especially in a strategy like this where you are hoping to get to turn 7, it can really just be a 7-mana 6/6 that makes 2 guys and attacks every turn. That impending, it can be less relevant for a deck like this in the long run, right?
Yeah. I mean, I found that I cast it for the impending cost almost all the time.
Yeah.
That seems to be the case because it's good against matchups with Wraths. And so having the ability to play it out and have it, sort of tucked away, it means you've got to draw out that get lost from the opponent or something like that. And so, yeah, I find that impending, because you play it a lot against like the grindier matchups, it tends to be like the more mana efficient play, and maybe you want to leave up your Fountain Port or something to sack a token if they wrath or things like that. But it just provides so much value, and that's the key here is like it can be 3 cards in one in a lot of circumstances. So yeah, good card. I actually run 2 in the sideboard as well, so we'll talk about that as well.
So, good segue to talk about your Wraths, actually. So we'll talk about your Wrath package as a wanna. Sure. Talk about the numbers in the Wrath package, and also why those numbers are. So you've got Day Judgment, you've got Sunfall, Temporary Lockdown. I'll probably include in a Wrath package as well, even though it's very to the ground. Yeah, sure. So yeah, tell us about it.
So first of all, my own personal thoughts are, and I've said this before, that any control deck for me needs to be running the Temporary Lockdown, because there are mono red and Convoke and Gruul Mice, which is obviously the big aggressive deck. You need it for it. You really, really need the ability to just take their stuff off. They're making things like Offspring tokens, and even if they destroy it, then they've got to pay mana to get that back invested in. I think Temporary Lockdown is needed, and that was something that some of the other decks were struggling. So we're playing a lot of like Split Up when I was on mono white control, which is great. I love the card, but it's not as good as Temporary Lockdown for just cleaning up that slate, and it being an exile as well is really important, because you've got is it the Heartfire Hero, which is the 1-drop that when it dies, it like pings you. This is so good against that card. So temporary lockdown, super good. Probably the most controversial thing is the one sunfall instead of multiple sunfalls, and I want to talk about that. This deck now runs, and we're going to talk about that as well, is the Ride's End. You don't need to run that exile effect now for 5 mana across the deck because you've got temporary lockdown and Ride's End to do the exile working for you. So in the past, you need the Sunfall because destroying isn't enough in the current meta. But now I think because of the shift in speed, you need that 4 mana Wrath in Day of Judgment instead of the extra mana to exile, which a Sunfall would require. The incubator token just isn't as good as it was before. And so that's why we've gone for that. Now I'm still running one Sunfall because I think Sunfall is still important, and a one-of is really good because there will be times that maybe you do need to exile. But generally, I think having the 3 temporary lockdown and the 4 Ride's End allow you the grace period to go more in on the Day of Judgment side of things. So that's the Wrath package. There's 7 Wraths in there, which feels like the right amount to me. I took this from Eli, as mentioned before, and through testing, this seemed to be completely correct. I get why it's the way it is, because I've been a big advocate of Sunfall because it just beats some decks. But in having a 5 mana Wrath, you are a little bit up against it by the speed of some other decks, which we have seen in the meta.
I absolutely love that your Wrath package is 3 at 3, 3 at 4, and 1 at 5. I think that's fantastic, and it lets you essentially match the pace of your opponent's curve with your own pretty gross curve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think having 7 makes it obviously like you will usually see 2 Wraths in a game at least. And when you're against mice that are hitting you for 1 billion on turn 2, it's nice to put them all in the mousetrap of a temporary lockdown.
Or of a Ride's End. Do you want to tell us more about Ride's End then?
We've skipped one, Josh.
Oh no, we're gonna save that.
Are we saving the best till last?
Yeah, we're saving that.
I like that.
Yeah,
so
it's not my first rodeo, Christian.
Oh, okay,
it's not my first rodeo.
Sorry. I feel like we're butting horns like to pro content creators here. So yeah, let's talk about Ride's End. So Ride's End, a bit of it's actually a common, and it kind of slipped under the radar in I think blue-white control lists for a little while because people saw it more of a card that was good for Beans decks because of the mana cost. But this card's just good. So it's 4 and a white for an instant, and it says this spell costs 3 less to cast if it targets a tapped creature. Sorry, tapped permanent.
Permanent, yeah.
Exile target creature or vehicle. We haven't seen many vehicles yet, but that would be relevant if Golgari start playing that vehicle that comes in and drains you. The Siege Rhino one, the name escapes me.
People.
Yeah. I don't like that card. But yeah, it's not my type of thing.
Sorry, Marco.
It drains me for life, so I don't like it. But this is really good against, exiling creatures. It's really good against creature lands and things like that. But I want to talk about why this card is so good. The real reason for a control player. There were other answers that you could do, which maybe target like an attacking creature. The important thing about this is it's a tapped permanent. You can cast this on an opponent's end step rather than when it's attacking. Now, for the control players listening will completely get why that's important, but just to sort of play it out, removing it in the combat step, which you had to do, I can't remember. I think it's not on my watch or something like that.
As an infect player, I think I know where you're getting with this.
Yeah, so you have to use it then, but now I can wait till the opponent's attacked. Maybe they've played out what they're going to do, and then I can decide whether to counter something, or I can do this on their end step. And maybe what they've done is they've held up their mana, or they've not wanted to overcommit to the board. Now I can punish them with removing their 1 threat. So that's made a big difference in making the deck viable. And so I actually didn't see loads of this. I saw some players playing a couple, but I didn't see many. But I think this is so good. And obviously it deals with that pesky little mouse that grows. And exiling is relevant. And of course it's great because it saves you the mana, as discussed, on being able to run less Sunfall.
When the aggro decks were running protection, So that's what I was going to. You don't want to fight. So decks that are running protection, especially aggressive decks, you don't want to fight them in the first main phase or combat. You don't want to do that.
Right.
You want to be fighting them in the second main phase, end step, or your turn. And this is excellent for in those situations. So I know they've moved away from the protection side of things, but it's still relevant. Make them, if they overcommit on the attack, whether it would be through I don't know, some cantrips or combat tricks, then you can punish. Then it's on your terms. If not, I'll take you 2 damage, and then in your end step, I'll remove threat. Sound.
Yeah. It's really good. I've been really impressed with it, and sometimes you will cast it for 5.
And then you've got Get Lost as well, which is sort of the removal, but more an overarching sort of removal spell with the sort of caveat you've granted them some map tokens.
Yeah. Now, Get Lost for me, I have a love-hate relationship with this card, and I know a lot of control players will be the same. It's in there because it's so useful and it's got really good utility against multiple different permanent types. The 2 maps is something you have to be really careful against the Valiant decks. Like, I mean, super careful. They always are able to get good use out of them, and you need to take that into consideration. That being said, the card is just super important because it gets rid of a Planeswalker. So, it can kill that pesky Kaito that everybody knows how much I like that card. But also, it gets rid of enchantments. The best use of this at the moment is if an opponent is foolish enough to leyline binding the Jace, and I get to destroy it and get my Jace back and mill them for 15. That is just chef's kiss. That is really good. But generally, this is like it's like an all singing, all dancing removal spell. Now, the map tokens obviously is a bit of a challenge, but we have to do them. We've got temporary lockdown to maybe get rid of them on the opponent's side of the board, and some decks make better use of them than others. The other deck that can use them is any decks running Fountain Port. Remember, they can pay 2 and tap to Fountain Port to sack 1 to draw a card. That's really powerful. So part of like when people are testing this deck, when they're really trying it out, please do think about whether it should be a Get Lost or a Ride's End on that permanent, because if giving your opponents maps too early in the game with Valiant creatures, you might be in for a bad time because they will get good use out of them.
Cool. So then you've got sort of the last sort of, before we move on to the start of the show, we've got some sort of like on the stack interaction as well in the form of No More Lies, negate, and change the equation. So why the split here?
So, I'd like to probably start with what's not here.
Okay.
Right? Because the question here for counter spell enjoyers is that there's no 3 steps ahead.
Yes.
So I haven't seen lots of control decks that don't run 3 steps ahead. For those who don't know, that is a blue mana spree card where you can pay the blue mana plus 1 and a blue to counter target spell, so it's a cancel. You can pay the blue and 2 generic to draw 2, discard 1. And you can also pay a blue and 3 generic to copy a target creature or artifact you control. I think I got that right. I did that from memory. So
it sounds very
impressive.
We'll see if the comment.
I believe you.
Yeah,
I believe you.
I believe you.
And so this is a card that I think is a trap, because the card itself has got an insanely high ceiling. And trust me, I would love to copy a Hornlock Whale or a Overlord of the Mistborn. I'd love to copy one. The floor is way too low of the card, because you're essentially, is anybody here going to run cancel in standard? 1 and 2 blue for counter target spell. I think that card is bad. It's difficult on the mana. You want double white more than you want double blue in the deck. And for me, I think counter spells in general are not at their best right now in the meta. You could say I'm wrong. You could say, Christian, you're talking absolute rubbish. But 3 steps ahead, I think, is a luxury this deck cannot afford in terms of how mana intensive that card is. The other thing as well is I played against mirrors that were running it, and I was able to counter it because they got greedy with the modes that they were taking. Some of them will run it instead of maybe, as another way to like draw and discard cards. But control players will not want to use that mode. It's like there's just something about it. Don't get me wrong. I think 3 steps ahead can win you games, but I think it will lose you more games than it will win because it's not very mana efficient. And I think we need to be more mana efficient with the cards that we have. It doesn't counter the big things that you need to counter when you need to counter them. So that it's not running that card. So just wanted to start with why that isn't it, because I think as a control player, that would be my first question looking at the list. Going into the other cards, I'll start with the one I've changed the equation. This card helps you in a counter war because it counters target spell mana value 2 or less. You'd be surprised how useful that is. And obviously, there is a prevalence of red and green in the format, and this hits those spells. So this will hit your green overlord and things like that. And it's just generally pretty useful card. It's as good as a one-off. There are some matchups you take it out for that you don't want it, but generally the card is good. It's one of those that performs better than it looks, and it's never dead game one. Which maybe it kind of can look at first glance. The next one is the negate. Now, so we're in an interesting point at the moment in standard, and I'm pleased as well you've used the actual art that I use on my negate. So shout out to Strixhaven and Mystical Archives. Weirdly, this card just doesn't seem to be dead. It's always useful.
Yes.
There's always something you want to counter. I've won games against like Gruul aggro because it counters the burst lightning and things like that, and it's really, really, really great card at the moment. So it just flat out counters the non-creature spell. This was great in the mirrors because I got rid of the Jaces. I was also able in some matchups as well to stop the Wraths again when I was playing a more aggressive game plan, and it also helped me resolve Jaces. So this card's been really, really good. There are some matchups where I don't want the negate, and I'll put that in the sideboard guide. But in general, game one, the negate's been really, really strong for me, so I like that a lot. And then the last one is No More Lies. I've seen a lot of lists running for No More Lies, but I have 2 problems with the card. The first is it's white and a blue, which it can sometimes be a little bit harder than you might anticipate. But the second is that this card is dead in late games in a lot of circumstances, unless you are like Giga Brain plays and you can like I do, and you can really outsmart your opponent with it. It's generally like difficult, especially like against a domain where like they've got 12 mana and they're casting like 5 mana things. You're just not going to catch something with it. But 2 is really useful. The exile effect's really useful as well. But I don't love the card enough to run 4 of them, and I think 2 is the right number. So yeah, I was impressed with Eli for working that out.
That's interesting, and you strike me as the type of control player, Christian, to read out that flavor text on No More Lies every time you make a Giga Brain play.
I actually don't know what it said. It said, "Lies fester and flourish in shadow. Our job is to bathe them in light." I love that. That's great.
One thing taking a look at this deck list is I'm very much just before we get onto the best card in the deck, I think. Sorry, everyone. But taking a look at this deck list, I am very much of, I believe it's Javier Dominguez, School of Thought. Apologies if it wasn't you said this, Javier. I know you're definitely watching. But his school of thought is you should never give your opponent a choice in Magic. If you let your opponent make the right choice, they might, and that could go wrong for you. So just give them a situation where they can't make a choice. I'm playing against this deck, let's say. I can see your Hornlock Whale as a 2-mana removal spell. I can see Change the Equation, Get Lost, Negate, No More Lies, and Ride's End as all 2-mana interaction. So as a player, how do I navigate this pool of interaction without making because I can see a turn where I've got him on Ride's End, I'm not going to attack, and then instead it's just Get Lost, or it's holding up Negate, or it's Change the Equation. How do I navigate this? Is this why this deck is so strong at the moment?
I never thought about it in that way, and I think you raise a really, really good point about it, because obviously I'm on the other side. But now thinking about how my opponents were reacting to like what my deck can do, I think that's absolutely the case. I think if you asked Dan that, there were times when he was like, hang on, this is like really difficult for me to navigate this. And a great example of that is like the Ride's End, holding up the mana for the Ride's End was made a big difference. Do I play out something straight into potentially a counterspell or a Wrath next turn? do I whack on the monstrous rage on this creature and then it's got a thing? So I think it presents the opponents with maybe like kind of like a different angle of what you're saying, in that I'm leading them into making the wrong decision, or or even worse, making no decision at all. And if I win the sort of the battle of making the opponent not make a decision, then that's the best outcome for me. So I think that, you're right, playing against this deck is like a real challenge. The mirrors were a slightly different build to this.
Sure.
And so, my understanding of the opponent is they were probably having a similar thing. But when I was in the other seat, I always felt like I was kind of in control. And, I felt like my answers were a little bit better than theirs. Part of that as well is not running the 3 steps ahead. I think the 3 steps ahead is one of the most telegraphed ones that they leave up. And you're right, having all that 2 mana interaction is a cornerstone of the deck. It's so important to have that 2 mana, because we have a very important 3 mana spell that we can only cast at sorcery speed.
I can't ignore this spell any longer. Me and Josh has tried to draw out as long as possible, but please tell us about this.
This is the best card printed in like the last 3 sets, in my opinion. This card is insane. And when you first looked at it, you were like, no, it's sorcery speed, it's never going to happen. It's so good. I absolutely love it. The card is, of course, Stock Up. It is 2 and a blue for a sorcery. And it says, look at the top 5 cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand, and the rest at the bottom of your library in any order. So this is, as how I spoke about Beza replacing the Wandering Emperor, this is the Memory Deluge. Now, let's talk about what's bad about the card. You have to tap out for it. You have to pay the 3 mana on your turn to do it. Now, as a control player, it is so much easier to keep the 2 mana open than it is to keep the 3 mana open. Hitting the 6th land drop is much more difficult than the 5th one. In many cases, you're probably using the Stock Up to find that additional 1 to get you to 5, so you can hold up some interaction. This is a card worth tapping out for, because you then can find the right tool that you need for that given situation. And many times you find it, sometimes you don't. But if you don't, you dig 5 cards deeper to finding the answer. And sometimes you just grab another Stock Up and then you can start chaining them. This was insane all day in every matchup, because against, let's say I'm against an aggressive deck, right? Haven't got the Wrath, but I do have a Stock Up. Well, I've just grabbed the land and a Day of Judgment. Let's go. Next turn, I'm going to go for it. Or, as I did against Dan, I already had a 4th land in hand. I tapped out for the Stock Up. I got a Beza and a Wrath. I think it was a Beza and a Temporary Lockdown. So now I can Beza, and then my opponent's got to do the resources, and I've just found those tools that I needed. This is what makes the deck playable. The deck is not playable without this card. In my opinion, the best card in the deck. It just helps keep everything ticking. I've spoken before about how with Control, the thing that we're really missing is card advantage. This scratches that itch and solves that issue. It is so effective, this card, and I would say to people, if they're thinking about running any type of Control deck at the moment, this is a 4 of must include. I never take it out in any matchup. It is always in the deck. It just bails you out of problems left, right, and center. So against the Control decks, you find your Jace, whatever, you find the cards you need.
So I compare some things in power level, like for example, the fetch lands into the fetch into Surveyor land. I compare that as essentially as powerful as drawing a card. This is almost like drawing 3 to 4 cards, because not only are you looking, maybe not 4 cards, but 3 cards. Like, I think I would rather look at the top 5 cards of my library and draw 2 specific cards than just draw 3 cards. Like, that's the choice there is so powerful. And I'm going to caveat this in 2 situations. The situation 1 is in a control deck, and the second one in a combo deck. Like, in a control deck, you need to find specific answers. In a combo deck, you need to find specific pieces. And when we had Sean Goddard on the last podcast, he was massive on this card because he was playing a control deck. Sorry, wrong. He was playing a combo deck. So he needs to find specific cards. That's way more powerful than just drawing 3. Like, it has to be, right?
It's almost like a Scry 5 draw 2.
Yeah.
Almost.
Yeah.
It's similar to that, and if you think about how powerful that is, this card is an absolute all-star. I can see it being played in different formats. I know it's a sorcery, which makes it
It's been
difficult.
it's been played in people have been playing with around with it in
Vintage.
Legacy as well and Vintage.
Yeah,
I
it's really good
think
in Vintage.
I think this is going into all my blue commander decks as well. This card's just really good. I just actually ordered 4 foil ones. So and if I'm ordering foils for them, then they know I believe in the card. So yeah, I think everyone by the time this comes out, I think everyone will be convinced by stock up anyway because of the results that it's putting out. But this card's insane. It's so good, and it was something that when you read it the first time, you're like, oh, it's sorcery or whatever. I think it's another one that I dropped in the chat and said this card's really good, and I was told that it wasn't. But we'll leave that there.
By me, I think.
No,
Probably.
this card's insane. In the right deck, you have to look at control/combo for this card to be really good. I don't think this is a tempo card necessarily. I've seen some people try it in tempo sort of shells, particularly in Legacy. But in those formats, you have free spells, so you can tap out, and you've got things like Force of Will, Force Negation, etc. But obviously, in Standard, it's a bit different. I think in Standard, it's particularly or specifically control and combo.
Yeah,
I mean, I've seen Pixie pick this up a little bit. The list of Esper Pixie that won the Standard showcase on Modo. Everyone has 2 copies of stock up in the list, and obviously all the comments like, congratulations on the win. How was stock up? And the Pixie player replied, apologies, I can't remember the name, but the Pixie player replied going, I never wanted to cast it. So I think you've hit the nail on the head there, really, Josh. This is a fantastic card advantage selection tool, very reminiscent of Dig Through Time. I'm not sure if anybody's gotten to cast Dig Through Time. It's pretty bonkers. But what the choice to play it should really come down to the deck and archetype rather than the power level of the card.
100%.
Yeah,
you found a good home for it here. So shall we just move on? We'll talk about the lands in Silver One. Christian, if you just talk about the lands, me and
sure.
Sam will just let you talk about it, and then we'll move on to the sideboard then.
Yeah, so as I said, the 60 is Eli Case's exact 60. This was what I found to really work. I have seen a lot of the other control decks running more meticulous archives and less Adokar wastes. I'm happy to have the 1 surveil land. I want to be able to cast my spells. I want the untapped ability. I'll talk about probably the most important cards in the sideboard, sorry, in the mana base.
Yeah.
The first being Blast Zone. If we could go to Blast Zone, this card is insane against Pixie decks, bounce decks, and it's also insane versus aggro as well. This won me games against aggro at the RCQ. Originally I only had 1 in the list, but I went up to 2. This card massively overperforms. It's really good. I was even at the stage where I was blowing up overlords with it in some of the longer matchups. Now this is essentially like your 8th and 9th Wrath in the deck. One thing to note is this can't hit your tokens, but I don't think it matters as much when you've got like your temporary lockdowns, except it does hit some tokens. It hits the offspring tokens as Dan discovered. Sorry, Dan. Because they have their copy, so they have the mana cost. Which is something I had to judge about when I was in Castleford, because I was like, does this work the way I think it does? He was like, yeah. I was like, let's blow them up then. No more mice. The other, so yeah, 2 Blast Zone really overperform. If you're not running them, please run them. I think that one of the controllers is running them, the other wasn't, that I played against. The other thing is the 3 Restless Anchorage as well. I've seen some lists running 4. I prefer 3. I really want to reduce my amount of tap lands. Must say that having the mana base like this, because usually I would probably have 1 or 2 more tap lands, felt really smooth yesterday. It felt like it was really working for me. I was finding that I was able to play my lands at the right time. So I think 3 is correct. For those who don't know about Restless Anchorage, it enters tapped. It taps for a white or a blue. And you can pay 1, a white and a blue, and make it a 2/3 bird with flying until end of turn. And when it attacks, it makes a map token. The map's really, really good because it attacks the Fountain Port, which I'll talk about in a second. But this is one of the win conditions of the deck. I ended up adding a dissection tools to one of them to win me the game in like a really cool line where like I wrath the board and then attach like the dissection tools by sacking another Restless Anchorage to win the game and things like that. But essentially, this is just a really, really good creature land. And obviously it generates some value as well with the map token. So yeah, I think we know this one by now. It's been in since Ixalan. And then Fountain Port, for me, one of the best lands ever printed. Yeah, I got to listen to Leon Tucker, the artist, talk about the card. Actually, I think Restless Anchorage is Leon Tucker as well. So shout out to him producing art for some insane
Yeah,
lands.
you're right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I've got him signed.
Yeah.
So Fountain Port, for those who don't know, taps are colourless. You can pay 2 and tap it and sack a token to draw a card, 3 and tap it to pay a life to create a blue fish, and 4 and tap and sack it. 4 and tap to create a treasure token. This is like a utility box of a land, and it's really important in the mirror. I remember game 1, I had to mull to 5, but I kept a 3 lands with a stock up, and one of the lands was a Fountain Port. Can't remember what the other card was in the hand, but I was like, I've got a Fountain Port, I've got a stock up, I've got game here. Like, I've got game against my opponent, and when my opponent didn't count the stock up, I was like, right, we've stabilized here on the card. That was against blue-white control. Fountain Port is just insanely good, so much value. Makes you creatures to attack with, sacks tokens to draw cards. You can even use it to accelerate your mana. Just all out all star. And then the rest of the mana base is kind of what you'd expect. There's one demo field in there just to as an additional answer to your opponent's creature lands. Now you're running 4 Rides Ends that can afford to be 1 and not 2. I think that maybe there are some matchups maybe you'd wish you had another one, but I don't think you can afford to have another colourless land in there after the 2 Fountain Ports or 2 Blast Zones in the demo field. I think that 5 is... You're already getting to like the maximum number of colourless lands you can have in the deck.
Sweet. Happy with the lands there?
Yeah.
Should we talk about the sideboard then? Go on, Sam.
No, I was just going to say, I think Christian hit a fantastic point there where you really want to cast your spells. And I think this is a good mixture of utility and, doing the important thing.
Cool.
Yeah, so if we move on to the sideboard, because I've changed the sideboard a bit from what Eli was running, because I feel like the Pro Tour lists were very teched into a Pixie and the bounce decks, which I've seen a lot less of in paper in the UK than I've seen in like Pro Tour level. So I wanted to be a little bit more teched for the meta. Authority of the Consoles is actually one of them, which I'm really not sure about, and I'm still not sure about. The reason why this card is in there is because I am absolutely terrified of Urabrask's Forge. That card scares me. It gives me nightmares. And I know that in the same vein, Sam, when we were in the store championship, when I played Authority of the Consoles and you had 2 Urabrask's Forge out, that changed the game completely. It's also obviously good against aggro decks as well. Like it's a generally good card. It shuts off haste, which is really nice. I landed one against one of the games against red deck wins, and it really helped because until they removed it, I had a few turns of knowing that I can actually see what they're going to play, and it's not just going to run at me and hit me for 3 or 4 that turn. So Authority of the Consoles is good. I'm undecided on whether or not this can continue. I would maybe run 2 Elspeth Smite, but I wanted to tech into more aggro because I believe that there would be a lot of aggro at the RCQ, and there was. So we need to make sure we tech for it. Beza, of course, is really good. That comes in, in a lot of matchups that, are aggressive, particularly. We want to bring that in against your mono red, your Gruuls, your Selesnya Cages, and stuff like that. Obviously against your Jeskai Convoke or Boros Convoke. So generally, it's just a really, really good card. We've talked about that one at length, so we can probably move on to Dissection Tools. Dissection Tools is great. Honestly, like this card, when you look at it, like you're thinking 5 mana for like a 2/2 with +2/+2 and Death Touch and Lifelink. This card's insane. Like you basically you can sack a creature the turn it comes down to give your creature Lifelink and Death Touch. And I did that against Dan when he was on mono red, and I attached it to the whale. I flashed in the whale, and then I attached it next turn to gain 8 life back. And let me tell you, mono red players do not want you to be gaining 8 life. No. They do not enjoy that one bit. But the thing with Dissection Tools is the opponent has to waste a real card on removing whatever it is that has the Dissection Tools on it. But you can just make a fish and attach it to something else. I attached the Dissection Tools to the Restless Anchorage to win the game. I think I sacked like something like an Overlord or something to do it so I could get in with damage. And the card just really overperformed. You're bringing that in against your aggressive decks because they can't really deal with it. And yeah, it was just an all-star for me, and it was a card that I'd never considered until I'd seen the Pro Tour lists. So yeah, I picked up a couple of them when I was in Chicago. The Elspeth Smite was a last-minute addition because I was convinced there was going to be a lot of aggro there on the day. So I basically put in an Elspeth Smite because it's just generally good against the aggressive decks. Also Exiles as well, so that can be really relevant too. We know that card for now. It's been in sideboards for ages. Yeah. Then we got Overlord of the Mistmores. You're going to bring this in against some of your grindy games, like your Golgari mid-range. You're going to bring it in against some of the Azorius matchups, but also obviously the Jeskai Convoke as well, where you just want to grab creatures on the board. We've talked about that already. I'm sure people know about this card by now. We've got the Graveyard Hate package. Now, I'd say 2 or 3 pieces of Graveyard Hate, depending on what you anticipate the meta to be. I've gone for 2 Rest in Peace and 1 Soul Guide Lantern, which is the same as what Eli went for. Soul Guide Lantern, I'm not sure about. I mean, I'm a big enjoyer of Ghost Vacuum. And that was another card that I dropped in the chat and said was really good and was told it wasn't, which actually was really good. But again, I'm not bitter about that one bit. But I wanted to try out the Soul Guide Lantern because that was what was in Eli's list. And in all honesty, it was never relevant. I didn't come up against any graveyard decks. But I think having 3 pieces, I was really prepared for that. Obviously, if you're against like the Azorius Omniscience Awakening deck, you know, you're going to need these pieces. You're going to mulligan for them. So that's really interesting. Actually, I've just thought as well, the Blast Zone is probably good against that as well because it gives you a way to get rid of the Abolisher post sideboard as well. So that's probably like a relevant card in that matchup too.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, so that's the Rest in Peace. The Soul Guide Lantern also has the ability to draw you a card as well, which is relevant. And obviously you can sack it to exile the whole graveyard. So I think that one is... It has a little bit more graveyard hate potential than the Ghost Vacuum, which is also like a bit of a win con. But I don't hate Ghost Vacuum here either if you wanted to do 2 Rest in Peace, 1 Ghost Vacuum. But yeah, the decks will be quite obvious what to bring in your graveyard hate against, you know, your Azorius Omniscience. I went up Tidebinder.
I love this card.
Yeah.
Well,
I have to... Sorry, Christian. I need to
no,
share...
Steve, you go for it.
I need to share Josh's love of this. On the surface, this card is mid to good. I played a game of Domain mid-range today against Domain. This card's insane with Kaito. This card has gone way up in my estimations.
I have
really
never
cool.
got to stop the ninjutsu trigger of a Kaito with a Tidebinder.
It's delicious. It is delicious.
What I mean, sorry, is I attack, and with no blocks, I return the Tidebinder to put a Kaito in a play against Domain. So I Tidebinded them like 3 or 4 times. It's crazy.
Brilliant.
And is that why you play this then, Christian? Is it because it's good against Kaito specifically, or is there a little more to this one?
I'd actually say this is probably one of the cards that you bring in the most post board. It's really good against a matchup. So I even brought in against the aggro decks because I was worried about the links. And also
Sunspire?
Sunspire links, and it also stops other things as well. You obviously want it against like your bounce decks. Anything that plays a Kaito, you want it against, but obviously, you know, Esper Pixie is just like ETBs. It's just like ETBs central. Sure. You can even counter the Storm Chasers thing to get the this town back and things like that. Domain, it's incredible into Domain because you stop the Overlord triggers or Atraxa if they're running into like just outright stops it. And post board as well, your opponents bring out removal. So, you know, you want that Tidebinder because then it is actually also a 3/2 as well. It's good against Oculus. It's good against Demir mid-range, obviously, because of Kaito. It's actually really hard to think of like some matchups where it's not got use in it because there's no real card like it. And because of the way that Standard is, well, it just Magic is in general, cards tend to have to do something really important. And to be able to stop that from doing the important thing and turning it off is massive. So, yeah, I bring this in probably more than any other card, which I put in the guide as well. So, I think there's a risk of overboarding it, but you
Yeah.
want it in, like, you want it against the
I
mirror
think
as well.
it falls to the those any legacy players amongst us. You know, Stifle's really good or Stifle's really bad. Like the card evaluation in this is really challenging, and when to bring it in, and when you don't need it, and when it because it you know it seems good in these matchups, but then you'd think actually, yeah, it is good in very specific situations. Is it good enough for me to actually board this in? And it challenges the pilot, this card, quite
Yeah.
more than if this card doesn't challenge you, then you're not thinking about it enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Honestly, there's just so many matchups that you bring it in for. Lastly, we've got the Wilt Leaf Liege. So the original list run, I think, 2 Balos and 1 Liege. I wanted to be. I didn't anticipate a lot of the Hopeless Nightmare decks,
Yep.
and so I went down to 2 because I still want it, but I want to be able to cast this spell because this is obviously in here for those matchups. However, if you come up against like a mirror or hard control deck, and you need to, if let's say you lose game 1, I would probably bring this in game 2 to play a more aggressive strategy, because this with the Overlord is so good because you're now hitting for 6 in the air a turn with the flyers, so it really shortens the game down. So one of my opponents brought this in against me game 2 because he lost it, and I was impressed with how the card performed in the mirror. But if I've won game 1 in the mirror, I'm probably going full control game 2. I'm not looking to play that aggressive game there where I really need to scrape a win back within time. But I was impressed by this. It was really good. But obviously, you know, if someone Hopeless Nightmares you turn 1 and you're like, hey, I've got a 4/4 now, get wrecked, you know. So it's a good card. I would say that the sideboard with blue-white control and even the main deck is something to always consider what the meta you're going into is like. It's a reactive deck, so you need to think about what your sideboard is. When I looked at the sideboard and when I played with the sideboard that Eli had done, I felt like that was really for the Pro Tour, and that in paper it needs to be a little bit broader with some of the things it's looking at. And so I went off the upper tie binder was a big one, because it's just so good into so many matchups right now. The ones I'm not sure about, the Authority Consoles and Elspeth Smite. I expect a very large aggro meta, and I think that maybe that could be 2 smites. But if Convoke makes a big comeback, you probably want 2 consoles and stuff like that. But overall, I'd say the split in between cards that you want to bring in against aggro, against the hand hate decks, against the domain decks, and against the graveyard decks is very well covered within this sideboard. I don't think there's like, oh wow, you could really do with X in there. I've seen lists that run 1 Devout Decree. I found the card to be a bit narrow. And of course, it is good into like your red matchups and like again, and it does get rid of the Kaito if they land the Kaito. But I found that the card was just like the sorcery speed didn't play into the rest of the game plan, and that I'd rather have an additional Tidebinder to deal with some of those things because it covers more matchups, and a smite so that I can, because it's a 1 mana, get rid of something in like against a heavy aggro deck. They're a little bit more, they hit more things. But you know, I'm interested to hear anyone's comments on the sideboard and feedback they've got. But just bear in mind, it is tailored towards the meta I did anticipate on the day.
I've got one comment about your sideboard, if you don't mind me being the first question bearer of this deck tech. We've touched upon Tashana's Timebinder significantly about how amazing it is and how often it comes in. Is there ever a world where you play these main?
Yes, you can. You can definitely play the main. I've seen some lists running 1 in the main. I'll be honest with you. I ran the main deck straight out of what Eli did, and I thought he got it right.
Cool.
Honestly, I think he got it right. The Tide Banner I do like, maybe like a one of in the main. But I think that people have been running it instead of the whale. I think that that's like the slot where people do it. Because I'm trying to think what else comes out, or maybe they don't run the same package. I think that I think it's a really good point actually, and I'm not entirely sure what the answer is, because bringing it in for so many matchups does raise the question. You know, should we run some of these in main? So yeah, I suppose I don't have the answer at the moment. I'll try it in the main and see how it looks. But I do love the main as it is as well. I'm trying to think what would come out. I think it being 3 mana as well can make a bit of a difference. 'Cause I talked about the 3 steps ahead,
Yeah.
but it is so good as well.
I think if we're bringing it in a lot and we're using stock up to grab it quite a lot, I think if we just take our 3 stock ups, bring in Shana's Highbinder, and you've always got in your hands, and
Don't
it,
don't
it's
do
at that point.
do not give Christian a hemorrhage. until we click
Anyway,
until we
I'm gonna
click stop
beat this deck.
until we click stop recording, then you can do it.
Sorry, everyone. I know I've just received my first hate mail, but it was
It's
a joke,
me.
all intended as a joke. Yes, it's
No,
literally
I
from
think basically
Christian.
the point though is, would you have a type? Maybe it's actually the Jace. Maybe because I think most lists run 3 Jaces. I mean, if we're going into a domain meta, domain and control, I want 4. I actually think if the meta shifts a little bit, then maybe you don't want 4 Jace. Maybe it is for a Jace.
Yeah, it's definitely not for stock up. We can say that much.
Yes, definitely not for stock up.
Definitely.
So Christian, we're going to wrap this up now, but before we do, give me the decks you would love to see to face any opportunity, and the ones you don't want to see. So good matchups, bad matchups, send them.
Okay, so good matchups is your aggressive decks, really good into your aggressive decks, but it also is good into your domain. I actually lost to domain. I got him down to 1 card, but unfortunately he didn't mill any of his Zers and was able to kill me with an up the beanstalk, which was a bit annoying on like when he had 1 card left in his
Yikes.
deck, which was unfortunate. However, it's not like an 80-20 in this deck's favor, but it's a positive matchup overall into domain because you have the 4 Jaces. You've got really good game plan against them. But the aggressive deck's really good. And aggressive decks, it's got loads of game versus Pixie as well, especially with the blast zones. Although the temporary lockdown's a bit of a trap, you probably take that out because it's a bit risky. The bad matchup that you don't want to face is any of the Kaito edgy guy decks. You know, the
Let's
ones which are
go.
like, oh hey, I play mid range. You know, I'm so edgy. Like, I can't wait to go to My Chemical Romance gig, bro. You know, like those type of people. That, by the way, I'm not having a go with you if that's your music. See, I'm just
I
saying,
love My
like,
Chemical Romance.
in my head,
You've
I've
just
got
got
a
hate
certain
mail from
idea
me.
of what a Kaito enjoyer is like, and I hate that card so much. You know, it is just a pain. It's really bad into those decks. It's good into general Golgari mid range. However, I've seen now that the Annex is coming back, so that's a bit of a wait. We'll see, because I think if they land an Annex and you've got to start using Get Lost on it, and then they're able to just accrue that value, it could quickly become a more difficult matchup. But I think the Golgari mid range is probably close to 50-50 if they run the Annex. If not, it's positive. But yeah, if you're playing into a meta and they've got 4 or 5 Kaito decks, honestly, it's just so difficult. It's really good into Convoke. It's lost a bit of game against Oculus because it's now running less Sunfalls, and we're not running things like the Exercise in the sideboard. But the Rides End's really useful in that matchup. So, I mean, I've beaten that deck as well. It's got game obviously post board against Omniscience combo. So I think if we take the Kaito decks to one side, I don't think the deck currently has any like real predators. But it's terrible into your Demir flash mid-range deck. You will really struggle in that matchup. I don't think there's much game there against them apart from the Tidebinder. And even still, that deck's just going to be really difficult for you to deal with. So, I mean, I'm comfortable seeing any other deck other than that.
It's the aggressive sort of strategy backed up by stack interaction. Because your Beza's really good against these things. Well, it's okay if your Beza gets spell stuttered, or your Wrath gets spell pierced, and then there's a threat beating you down. Like, they're the sort of decks you want to avoid, which is interesting because the traditional, like when I first started Magic, the traditional triangle was aggro beats control, control beats mid-range, mid-range beats aggro, and this sort of like doesn't follow those patterns at the moment. It seems to be a really powerful deck to come into this meta, honestly.
I think if we see more blue-white, we will start seeing more Demir mid-range.
Kaito, yeah.
Yeah. But just so you know, by the way, I've said the Kaito decks, but I really do mean the Demir mid-range ones. The bounce deck is a lot more is a lot better. It's
Sure.
specifically like your fairy masterminds, your flood pits drowners, and all that type of stuff because it's just your opponent's just constantly playing on your turn, and they
The audacity.
and
The audacity.
they always have a siren, and then turn 2 they've got a fairy mastermind. I don't know how they do it, and then turn 3 kite. I would love to learn the skill of how to always have that in my hand, but unfortunately I have not learnt it yet.
Well,
I wish I had
to
that
be
skill.
fair, Christian, you can't do that because you're not playing any of those cards.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true. But yeah,
If you're scratching your head at that one, there's a big one in the room for that. But no, I think to be honest, I might like being the guy who goes temporary lockdown into Beza into Jace. That sounds much more fun.
yeah, I would recommend if you're a control enjoyer to give the deck a try. I would try it as it is in the main board, but tailor the sideboard to how you anticipate the meta to be. Because if there's no one hitting your hand with discard, you maybe don't want the lieges. If there's no one on the graveyard decks, you can go down. I would always keep 2 pieces of graveyard just in case someone shows up. But if you don't anticipate any, go down 2. But I hope that that's been a good overview of the deck. And certainly have given some insight into my experiences with it. For those that I played a lot of mirror matches, which can be quite skill intensive, and I think that the big differences was the 4 Jaces and not having the 3 steps ahead and being a little bit more efficient with the mana because the opponents had to use more mana to do the things that I was doing.
Sweet. I'm happy, by the way, Sam.
Yeah, I mean we've gone through absolutely everything, and even some useful tips and tricks. Again, we'll include the Sideboard guide just so if you are as masochistic as Christian is and want to play all of the magic in the room, then there's some tips and tricks there for you as well. But no, I'm very happy to, Josh. That was a great overview, Christian. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, if for those who want to see me anywhere else, you can find me over on our main YouTube channel, Chad Magic, or in Bologna. So let's go get some pasta.
I want to go get the pasta. I don't necessarily want to get milled out by Jay, so we'll have to meet in the middle there, Christian. But no, that's perfect. Thank you very much. If you're watching, thank you very much for tuning in, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and all of that jazz. And we'll see you next time.
Cheers, everybody.
Bye.